Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thanks to the organizer for a wonderful, wonderful conference. So there we go. What counts? So our conversation about counting started with a bit of banter, as it happens, between us. Charlotte very kindly accepted to read something I was writing, and one bit of comment was surprisingly vague. The surprisingly vague, admittedly so bit, said something like a handful of occurrences. In fairness, I did mean an actual handful, like as in 5, but my paragraph was so packed up with numbers that I was just paraphrasing. As usual, Charlotte was right, because I didn't specify whose hand I was talking about. So not so much a problem of, the Centaurian warrior will be explained to you about poor reason later. The problem was not so much a problem of precision, but of perspective. And perspective is exactly the main theme of our talk today. So we'll steer clear of anything to do with metrics and statistics. So if that's what you expected from the counting bit, sorry about that. We will ask some very broad questions about counting. We're not probably going to say anything particularly new. In fact, we're going to reflect on something extremely, extremely familiar, the undisputed premise of Corpus Linguistics, that counting counts. And here in Birmingham, back in 2017, Susan Hunson shared her personal reflections and very cool dinosaur clip art on Corpus Linguistics. One of the cores that she discussed was that quantity has always lain at the heart of Corpus Linguistics. Naturally, we concordanced heart of Corpus Linguistics, and Susan also naturally was spot on and not alone. You may recognize some of your own text there. Tony's there twice, since we're counting. And you see that quantification and quantity are obviously very, very pervasive. The other pattern that we'd like to draw your attention to, because it will become important later in the talk, is this idea of discovery, of course, making it possible to see patterns that would otherwise go undetected. And that's one of Tony's quotes. So at the heart of Corpus Linguistics is finding examples, finding out things about language, and counting how frequent they are. And so locating and counting are basically the two things our tools are designed to do in various ways, in various forms, but those are the two things they're designed to do. So we find so that we can count, and we count so that we can find out things about language. We see patterns that otherwise, like we said, would be invisible to the naked human eye. That is the basic of everything. And I'm not going to go into that because, you know, handful of very influential quotes you can just look up at. Seeing patterns, as Mike says in the last one, is a human disposition. Counting is a way of making those patterns available to be seen. So counting is not, in fact, the most important outcome of Corpus Linguistics. It's its most fundamental means. Recognize that guy? So the premise of Corpus Linguistics is in counting. The precondition, according to many of us, to do more interesting, more exciting things, as both Paul and Anne put it when Robbie asked them, what does Corpus Linguistics mean to you? And going back to Robbie's podcast, I'm a huge fan. This is the most frequent content words in response to Robbie's questions, what does Corpus Linguistics mean to you? And size and vision, plus empowerment and excitement are central. So why do we count? Because it's exciting, just said, the exciting discovery, so the idea of discovery. Of course, because it's safe. It's a safe way to identify patterns because we know it's accountable and replicable. And because it matters. Repetition is powerful. Patterns are habits of form, and habits of form form habits, or constructionists. So it's, in a nutshell, what Paul calls the incremental effect of discourse. Here, in another handful of influential quotes, and also not necessarily Corpus Linguistics quotes. So this is a point where we meet with less quantitative-driven people, like Fairclough. So our title, What Counts? The title plays on a double tension that is well summarized by a famous quote often misattributed to Einstein, but sociologist William Bruce Cameron says in the longer quotes, and I read, "It would be nice if all the data that sociologists require could be enumerated and run through machines and drawn charts, but not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." So a double tension between what is measurable and what cannot be measured, hence availability, and between what is measurable and what matters, hence meaningfulness. Along with the intertwined with what Gavin said about context, the other criticism attributed to cats, so lack of context on one side, is that it's not able to count what really matters. So it only counts what is easy to count, the mindless number crunching. We're familiar with the prosodies, so I'll give you a minute to read the prosodies there and the metaphors. A fairer criticism would be that corpus linguistics is not able to count everything that counts, but then who can? So what is it that we count? And I'll pass it on to Charlotte to give you the answer.
I'm not sure about answers. But what do we count then? Well, as good corpus linguists, we find out by counting, right? Every talk we've been to at the conference, and we have tallied them, has involved counting of some kind. So what we counted was a whole set of articles from the latest issue of these 7 journals. And there are lots of editors and authors of these journals in the room. So when we say, what do we count, we really mean, what do we count? And what we count is a range of things. We count words, we count patterns, we count categories. We count categories a lot. And another way we can think about what we count is how these layer up then from words to patterns, or words to categories, or words to patterns to categories. But even if we start with that simplest form of the word, it's not actually so easy to work out what it is that we're counting. The first thing that we do when we start corpus linguistics is learning the difference between types and tokens, right? Different ways of thinking about words. So, like Gavin, we're going to draw on our own examples, mostly because we're more comfortable being a bit reviewer two-ish with our own stuff. And so this is from one of the projects we've done on nostalgia, where we're looking at the representation of nostalgia. And part of that was looking at the metaphors that are used to frame nostalgia. So you can see here we've got liquid and sight and pain and journey. And even without looking in detail, you can see these 2 charts look different. If we count types and tokens, we start to see different things. And to make that a bit more visible, I'm going to take out most of it. And if you look at the yellow charts there, you've got the journey. And what you can see is that if we look at types, journey doesn't seem to count very much. But if we look at tokens, it counts a lot more. And of course, what's happening there is that the journey metaphors are very heavily conventionalized. There are a lot of nostalgia trips, many tokens, few types. So what we count is not straightforward. And what we count, the types or tokens, has an impact on what we find and what we can find. So in a way, what we're doing when we count this range of things, words and patterns and categories, is counting a range of things that vary from a very direct counting to a more abstract or interpretive form of counting. So the easiest question here would be, how many times does wave co-occur in the context of nostalgia? It's a very straightforward question. I've got 2 things I look at in co-occurrence and 1 number. But it's not a very interesting question, right? So you'd want to know, okay, is this a pattern? So you'd say, well, how many lexicalizations are there for nostalgia is a liquid? And to answer that question, you have to operationalize liquid. So we need to look at wave and tide, but also steep and seep and wallow and all of those. And then, of course, we go on a step to what we're really interested in as discourse analysts, which is, well, so what? What's happening in terms of the evaluations? And this is where we get to the more abstracted And another way of saying it is the more complex forms of counting. So we can think of this layering of counting as involving increasing complexity. And the area that's likely to be most interesting for us as people interested in discourse and pragmatics is going to be that bottom right. So we can think of this, what do we count, as being about a range of things from direct to more indirect, and essentially that becomes a range of things from somewhat easier to much more challenging. And so Greece says we have to count strings of elements in order to access the complex concepts like meaning. And at the heart of this is operationalization, because we're moving from what is direct to what is indirectly captured. And so in a way, we're going to take a sidestep now to think about these challenging things that we count. And we do. We manage to count. And the first reason why things are likely to be challenging is exactly this, because they are difficult to operationalize, difficult to use strings to find meanings. So to take an example that I imagine caused many challenges here in Birmingham, the first chapter of evaluation in text starts with, what do we mean by evaluation? And I think we'd all agree, if you have to start by explaining what something is, if it's difficult to conceptualize, it's going to be somewhat difficult to count. And at the heart of this is operationalization. As Labov says, at first glance, counting would seem to be a simple operation, but even the simplest type of counting raises a number of subtle and difficult questions. The final question, decision as to what to count, is actually the solution to the problem in hand. This decision is approached only through a long series of exploratory maneuvers. And so this is something we approached in our studies of nostalgia. We've been interested in how nostalgia is framed, but we've also been interested in how and when it's performed as well. So in looking at how it's framed, we've seen a number of assertions about the rise of nostalgia, that we're doing more of it. But is it true? Well, we'd have to count to find out, but we can't count directly because, unfortunately for us, we don't walk around going, I am nostalgizing now, right? So we need to find ways of identifying something that doesn't have a single form function or form framing relationship. And of course, this is the next stage of what makes things challenging. So how did we try to find nostalgia? Well, and this is a speaker-exclusive we organized a workshop at Bologna. We took a bunch of brilliant people. We closed ourselves up in a castle for 3 days. And we brainstormed. We tested ways of counting nostalgia. And at the end of each day, we shared these methods that we'd been exploring for identifying nostalgia. And those who were there will remember we had varying degrees and types of success. For instance, something like fond memories, great success, as in excellent precision. Almost every time we looked at fond memories, we found nostalgia. Terrible recall. This much of the corpus, actually, that involved nostalgia, involved people saying fond memories. Okay, mostly people don't label it in those ways. So it is indeed a long series of exploratory maneuvers. So the other things that might make it challenging to count are not necessarily to do with the operationalization, but to do with sort of more pragmatic features. So sometimes things are going to be challenging because they're rarely occurring. And it might be that they're rarely occurring in a naturally occurring way, or it might be a kind of engineered rarely occurringness. Those of us who try and add context, for instance, to our searches through filters, find that you get decreasing numbers of hits, right? To the point that you've got so few that you wonder, do I have enough to count at this stage? We might find that things are challenging to count because they haven't been facilitated by a corpus design. So for instance, if we think of the work that I've been doing on the parliamentary data, it was, if I want to look at who is performing nostalgia in that context, I could look at it quite easily according to gender and political party. But actually, for someone interested in nostalgia, a much more interesting hypothesis to test would be around the age of the speaker at the point that they are nostalgizing. And that's not embedded in the corpus. You have to go and find that out elsewhere. Similarly, it might be challenging because it hasn't been traditionally facilitated by our software. If we look at the Book of Abstracts for this conference, there's a lot of keyness, a lot of keywords, not so many lockwords around okay? That's what's facilitated by the software that we are all using. It might be that things are challenging because until we find it, we don't know that it's there. We know that the process of research is never as linear as we like to pretend in our conference papers at events like this. So we count things that are challenging. It just takes a lot more effort. And we also count a range of things that cast light on the same phenomenon. Gavin was talking about triangulation. And this is where we're trying to get multiple windows onto the same room. We're trying to find multiple ways of counting to access the same kind of phenomenon. And ultimately, we're counting the things that we can count. It becomes a question of availability. So we count many things, and all of us, we do it very well. We count layers of things. We count multiple things. We count some things. We could always be counting some other things. And yet, we need a note of caution or reflexivity on what it is we count and whether what we count counts. We know that counting frequency doesn't necessarily equate counting resonance. Some voices are more powerful than others. Each of us will have something that's been said to us once that we still remember. We know that things which are very quiet can be very powerful. There are things that never need to be said because it is so fundamentally assumed to be true. And it may also be that repetition can have a numbing effect as well as a kind of intensification effect. So what we count is never straightforward, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that how we count is also similarly complex.
So how we count and what we count are obviously intertwined and related in ways that it was difficult to separate them. The overall takeaway from this bit is that the ways we count are heavily theory-laden, and the counting, of course, must be underpinned by the question and the corpus and the context, because it will impact the results, the way that we count. We've been shown by the graph before from the journals that what we count is often categories, and we've been counting around the conference, and it has been the most frequent thing, categories. So here I'll just focus on segmentation and classification. So let's take the level of aggregation of diachronic variable, for example. This case is a periodization of the timeline in BBC program Desert Island Discs. If we take decades, which is our default in the corpus we built unit, this is what the distribution of nostalgia words would look like over time. So nostalgia, nostalgic, etc., etc. But if our unit was individual years, we can start to see that some years were affecting quite clearly the spikes in the decades that we've seen before. And if we break it down to individual episodes, to days, that becomes even clearer. And we find out that the main cause, the sole cause almost, for the peak in the 1960s is a single recording from 1965. And here, the how do we count becomes doubly important because in that episode, the word nostalgic was in fact uttered only once. But since the recording is a tiny fragment, only 341 words, and since we're counting occurrences relative to text size so that we can compare, we get a very impactful counting there. This is to illustrate that different segmentations give us different perceptions and will bring us to do different things with our data, and that the contextual knowledge of our corpus is very much needed at all times to understand. So the more we know our corpus, the better it is. Without knowledge of the corpus, the default segmentation in decades, as we've seen, gives us an imperfect picture, like we say, there's a wrong picture, basically, which doesn't automatically mean that we should prefer very fine-grained segmentations because then we can see everything, but we need contextually informed segmentation. In this case, perhaps the most appropriate level of aggregation would be actually not be diachronic at all, not strictly speaking diachronic units, but host eras. It's all Roy Plumley's fault if there's nostalgia in Desert Island Discs. Different contexts and different purposes hence will require different levels of granularity, and this applies, of course, also to the granularity of our analytical categories. Classification is, by definition, a flattening of nuance and complexity, and we want that because we navigate between the fine balance of capturing meaningful detail, but at the same time getting the big picture, like with big numbers, big pictures, general impression and generalizations we can make, of course. And we spend a large part of our working days looking at lists of words or stretches of text and sorting them into categories based on some ground of similarity so that we can count them in bulk, so that they mean something different to us. But words, as Labov also said on top of that quote, are slippery customers. So they're intrinsically resistant to labeling and to fitting into arbitrary, purpose-dependent interpretive artifacts that are categories, not natural things in the world. They're just the way we divide the word, of course. So ideally, we think that we have categories that should be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive set of boxes organized around a coherent parameter. Those categories that allow us to have neat histograms or bar charts, as I learned yesterday. But our categories are often not discrete and not mutually exclusive. They overlap, there's smudge in the periphery. Members of one category may belong to other categories. Not all members of a category are equally representative. Lizzie taught about that yesterday. So not all cups are equally cup-like, and not all birds are equally birdie, right? And membership may change over time and across contexts. And I just give you a few examples of what these things mean in practice. So we can, as I said, have different categories that allow precise counting. For example, sorting concordances into mutually exclusive binary categories. Here's who is nostalgia attributed to, self, other, or not quite clear. But things are seldom this simple. Because of the complexity of language, even blunt binary categories such as quantity, quality, or positive, negative, as we know, have interplaying fuzzy boundaries, and the membership is often overlapping and multiple. Take, for example, quantity and quality. If I say something like tinged with nostalgia, we have negative quality of distortion. At the same time, we have tinge as in a little bit. So a little bit of nostalgia is not so bad after all, so it's not really bad. And this idea of intensity interplaying with positive and negative happens a lot. So if we found that a large proportion of collocates of nostalgia words in the news, and increasingly so over time, were related to expression of quantity and particularly excesses. And excesses proved to be a bad thing. So too much nostalgia, not a good thing. Wallowing in nostalgia, not a good thing. So quantity is quality, obviously, okay? And also, bluntly divided quality collocates and quantity collocates, it's not very much working for our counting because they tend to co-occur with each other. Things that we have classified as qualitative and things that we have classified as quantitative, they nest, they overlap. So maybe they shouldn't be counted separately. On top of all of this, there is the issue of when do we count. So sometimes we count from collocates lists because it helps us making sense of things, right? So we put things in coherent, nice semantic categories that look good together. But then when we look at the behavior in context of those collocates, they surprise us. And that's part of the game, that's part of the analysis. So take cozy, for example. It fits in the warm and fuzzy category, but it doesn't behave warm and fuzzy, okay? It's not cozy as in comfortable, but it's a patchy exercise in nostalgia. It's sickly. It's very heavily negatively laden. So, as we said, the last thing in the category slide was about categories changing, potentially changing membership. This could be very nicely presented in terms of a diachronic change, so change of meaning, but we didn't have any of those within the nostalgia setting, so we decided to go for something else. And if we take the aforementioned exercise in is a collocate of nostalgia everywhere we looked, in any corpus. It's largely consistently negative. Its other collocates are things like futility or political necrophilia, but not so in the desert island discs corpus, which means that if we were comparing corpora, they couldn't be counted together as indicators of negative prosody. In desert island discs, it doesn't behave completely differently because everything is rosier. In desert, other collocates that are negative with nostalgia in desert island, in the other corpora are also negative in desert island discs. So it was surprising to see that an exercise of would behave completely differently there. All of this, to boil down to the takeaway I began with, there are different ways to intend and use categories. So we can intend our categories to be a product, so the result of our analysis and our interpretations. They will then afford us measurable taxonomies. We can have histograms and bar charts. But this type of categories is rarer in Cad's work. And sometimes, I dare say, less interesting in Cad's work. Most often we use categories as flexible and transient, so they are part of the process, and sometimes we get rid of them entirely. They're instrumental to making sense of things and to find ways to see the data. The same collocate can give off different patterns, as we've seen with metaphors as well, the wallow that came back a few times in the slides. And if we allow those multiple, messier categorizations to interact, they may render the intrinsically complex and rich meaning of language. They are, however, not very well histogrammable.
So, from the complexity of counting to a really very basic question is, what counts as a big number? So, an occasional, very infrequent, occasional experience at a Corpus Linguistics conference might be that somebody stands up and says, this feature occurs this many times in my data. And an occasional experience might be that some of us, many of us, shrug a bit and go, yeah, is that a lot or not? And this is what it really comes down to. How do we know if our numbers are big? How do we know if they're big enough to count? So to continue the dinosaur sub-theme established by Susan, are these big dinosaurs or not? And you might use context to answer, because I've left the names in for you. But otherwise, we don't know if they're big unless we have some point of reference. So in I go, average size human, yeah, they're pretty big, right? And this is what Corpus Linguistics does. Of course, it's built into what we do in Corpus Linguistics. Collocation is telling us something relative, right? So that's why you've got imperial collocating there with nostalgia, not the. Keywords, of course, are based on looking at relative frequencies. But what happens when we're trying to count something a bit indirectly? What happens when we're trying to address those more challenging kinds of counting? So if we go back to those questions that I posed earlier on, and we look at that middle one, well, how many lexicalizations are there for nostalgia is a liquid in the press? This is something that we can start to access. We operationalize liquid, and you can see here that we've got wallow and wave and be in a wash and steeped and so on. We can count them up. Whether we go for tokens or types is an issue that we deal with. We know this is one pattern, but how do we know if it counts? How do we know if this is actually characteristic of talking about nostalgia in the Times versus knowing this is how the Times talks? And to answer that question, we'd need an extra set of data. So this is a project I worked on a couple of years ago, where we just looked at the occurrence of certain source domains being used metaphorically in the UK press. And you can see there are a lot of water metaphors around. There are even more water metaphors in the Times specifically. So before we can answer these questions about, well, what characterizes the presentation of this phenomenon or this group of people, we need to have some kind of baseline of, well, what is just normal in that particular context? So we need baselines, we need to know what's normal, what's happening elsewhere, and then very closely connected and intertwined with that, we need to know about availability. Well, what could happen? What are the opportunities for this to occur. So here's my mea culpa slide. I was doing some work looking at the use of nostalgia in parliamentary discourse, and I was looking at particular forms of nostalgia with words like pride and proud. And I noted that both pride and proud co-occurred with references to migrants by male speakers, as did shame. And then somebody walked past a screen a bit like this and said, yeah, but there's loads more men MPs, aren't there? And I said, yes, thank you. And they were absolutely right. Actually, talking about pride and proud and shame in co-occurrence with talking about migration is absolutely more characteristic of the women speakers in the House of Commons. So what counts as a big number is not about frequency. We know there are things that might be invisible to the naked eye because they're too big, we just can't count them as humans, or because they're too small. They're too rare for us to notice until we start categorizing and collecting them up. And counting is always going to be relative. We can't say what counts in the sense of what's characteristic of a discourse or some other variable without knowing, well, what happens elsewhere and what can occur. So we're moving towards nearly our penultimate question. This one is, what shouldn't we count?
Yeah. So circling back to the tension between availability and meaningfulness, just a taste of shouldn't we count, the bean counting or jelly bean counting in this case. So we shouldn't count something just because it's countable. We can count it. It's easy to count. It's available in our metadata, as we've seen. We shouldn't count something just because it has been counted before. So, say it's a well-established categories just because it's well-established. And finally, we shouldn't be counting, well, not finally, probably there are more ways, but we shouldn't be counting as something just because it has been counted before. And we'll both like to close with Tuve's brilliant blog entry on this. So the fact that,
So that's the penultimate question is then, well, what haven't we counted in this? And of course, that's an infinite variety of things because that's how absence works. But some of the obvious ones are going to be, well, we haven't talked about corpus size. And actually, that's the first thing that any student asks me about counting. Is my corpus big enough to count, right? We haven't touched on statistics because there are many people better qualified to do that. We haven't talked about the visualization of findings, how you make things count for your audience. We haven't talked about the types of findings. There are many different types of findings that we have. And I think one of the things that we're all aware of is that certain types of findings get more attention, get more visibility. Not many of the papers we've been to have concluded saying, we did all of this, and to be honest, there wasn't much there. But that's a really good finding. That counts, right? Also, we're pushed towards particular kinds of findings, as Paul and Tony have said. There are certain types of research findings which will attract funding. And so these may end up being prioritized by what we decide to count. So what? So, what counts? Corpus Linguistics, the thing that unites us here at this brilliant conference that Robbie has organized, is really based on the foundational assumption that counting is meaningful. And what counts for us, maybe us, is that counting's got to be underpinned by the question, the corpus, and the context, going back to Gavin's talk. And that counting is something that we're aware of. As Lizzie said yesterday, evaluation takes courage, right? And what we so often want to argue is that what counts is our self-reflexivity. In this case, the awareness of what we're counting, what we're not counting, and why. And Mike Scott and Chris Tribble talk about how corpus analysis combines data manipulation, imagination, and pattern perception. And we might also want to conclude then that counting is part of each of these. It's an imaginative process because of that decision-making that underpins all of it, and because of the patterns that it reveals to us. Thank you very much.